She came to the cemetery to clean up her husband's grave, but suddenly noticed a strange hole in the ground. At first, she didn't pay much attention to it, but something made her come back with a shovel. What she discovered under the layer of earth turned her life upside down. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Celeste had been visiting the cemetery every Thursday for the past year. It had become a ritual, one she followed religiously, as if maintaining this habit could somehow keep the connection between her and James alive. She would bring fresh flowers, clear away fallen leaves, and sit beside his grave, speaking softly about her week. It wasn't that she truly believed he could hear her, but there was something comforting about speaking aloud, about imagining that somewhere, somehow, he was still listening. The cemetery itself was quiet, nestled on the outskirts of town. Most of the graves were old, the names on the headstones worn and barely readable. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The trees that lined the paths were nearly bare now, their branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. The late autumn chill made the air crisp, and Celeste pulled her coat tighter around herself as she kneeled beside James's grave. That was when she noticed it. The ground near the headstone looked disturbed, the earth darker, looser than the rest of the surrounding soil. At first, she thought she was imagining it, that maybe the shift in the season had made the ground settle unevenly. But as she brushed away some of the leaves, she saw it more clearly, a shallow indentation in the soil. Her fingers traced the edge of the disturbed earth, a frown forming on her face. She glanced around, but the cemetery was empty, aside from an old groundskeeper raking leaves at the far end. If someone had dug here, it had to have been recent. The thought sent a chill through her, and she quickly placed the leaves back over the spot. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it was nothing. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. When she returned the following week, the sight made her blood run cold. The indentation had deepened. Someone had been here again. Someone had continued digging. Celeste's heart pounded as she stared at the disturbed soil. There was no question now. This wasn't the work of an animal or the natural shifting of the ground. Someone had been tampering with the grave. She scanned the cemetery, but, as always, it was nearly empty. The same old groundskeeper was working a few rows away, but he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. Taking a deep breath, Celeste tried to shake the feeling of unease creeping up her spine. It wasn't like she could go to the police about a hole in the ground. What would she even say? She told herself she wouldn't think about it, that she'd leave it alone. But she couldn't. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she kept picturing the disturbed soil. Who would dig near James's grave? And why? The thought gnawed at her, and by morning, she had made up her mind. She had to know what was buried there. The next evening, just before the cemetery closed, Celeste returned, a small gardening spade tucked inside her bag. Her heart pounded as she approached the grave, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. The groundskeeper had left for the day, and the cemetery was empty, bathed in the dim light of the setting sun. Kneeling beside the disturbed soil, she hesitated for only a moment before pressing the spade into the earth. The soil was loose, easier to dig than she expected. Every movement sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Her fingers trembled as she worked, but she kept going, the need to know pushing her forward. Then the spade hit something solid. Celeste froze. The metal clink echoed in the silence, unnervingly loud in the stillness of the cemetery. She dug more carefully now, pushing the soil away with her hands. Slowly, something began to emerge from the dirt. A box. It was metal, rusted, and about the size of a shoebox. She wiped the remaining dirt from the surface, her breath coming in short, nervous bursts. It wasn't locked, but the lid was stiff with age and grime. Her hands shook as she pried it open. Inside, a small bundle wrapped in cloth lay neatly placed, along with a stack of papers bound together with red thread. But it was what lay beneath the papers that made her blood run cold. A gun. Celeste's fingers hovered over it, her breath hitching in her throat. The metal was old, but still gleamed under the dimming light. She had never touched a gun in her life. What was it doing here? Who had put it there? Her gaze snapped back to the stack of papers. With trembling hands, she lifted them out, unraveling the red thread that held them together. The first page made her heart nearly stop. She knew this handwriting. It was James's. Her vision blurred for a moment as she stared at the inked words, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. He had written this. But why? And when? The letter was brief, but its message was chilling. If you're reading this, it means the worst has happened. I didn't know if I would have time to explain, but if you found this, you need to leave it alone. Do not go any further. Do not ask questions. Burn this letter and forget you ever saw it. Celeste felt her pulse hammering in her ears. James had hidden this. He had buried this box, and someone else had been looking for it. Her hands trembled as she quickly placed everything back inside, closed the lid, and covered the hole as best as she could. The weight of the discovery pressed against her chest, suffocating. She had come looking for answers. Now she had more questions than ever. As she walked back toward her car, her mind reeled. She had to figure out what this meant. She had to know why James had left this behind. But she also knew one thing for certain. Whoever had been digging before her, they would be back. Celeste drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart still pounded from the discovery she had made at the cemetery. The metal box, the gun, the letters, especially the letter. James had buried them there for a reason he had never shared with her while he was alive, and someone else had been looking for it. The thought made her stomach twist into knots. She had always believed she knew everything about her husband. He had been kind, loving, and honest, or so she had thought. But the letters suggested a different story, one she hadn't been prepared for. She reached her house and pulled into the driveway, her hands still trembling as she turned off the engine. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring out the windshield. The street was quiet, the houses dark except for the occasional porch light. Everything looked normal, but she no longer felt safe. The eerie sensation of being watched clung to her, making her skin prickle. She glanced into the rearview mirror and saw nothing unusual. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. She grabbed the metal box from the passenger seat and hurried inside, locking the door behind her. She double-checked the locks, then pulled the curtains closed. Only then did she let out a long, shaky breath. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what this all meant. Setting the box on the kitchen table, she carefully lifted the lid again, as if expecting something new to appear inside. The letters were there, the gun still wrapped in its cloth, the medallion lying on top. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The face inside was familiar. It was James, smiling in the small, worn photograph, but next to him stood a man she didn't recognize. Who was he? And why had James kept this hidden? She placed the medallion down and reached for another letter. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded the paper, reading each word with growing dread. James wrote about danger, about secrets he had kept for her own safety. He warned her not to trust anyone. He mentioned a key. Celeste scanned the box, but saw no key inside. Had it been taken, or had James hidden it elsewhere? Her mind raced with questions, but one thing was certain. Whoever had been digging at his grave wasn't just looking for answers. They wanted something specific. A loud noise outside made her jump. She turned sharply toward the window, heart hammering. It had sounded like a car door slamming. Carefully, she moved to the curtain and peeked outside. A black sedan sat at the curb, the same one she had seen at the cemetery. Her breath hitched. They had followed her home. She backed away from the window, her mind spinning. What did they want? The box? The letters? Did they know she had them? Her pulse pounded as she tried to think. She couldn't stay here. She needed to leave, to go somewhere safe. But where? She reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Call the police? What would she even say? That her dead husband had left her a cryptic warning and now strange men were following her? They'd think she was paranoid. Her eyes flicked back to the box. James had said not to go looking for answers, but she was already too deep. If she ran now, she might never find out the truth. She had to be smart. She had to figure out what these men wanted before they got to her first. She grabbed the letters, stuffing them into her bag, but left the gun. The thought of carrying it terrified her. She had never even held a firearm before, let alone used one. Instead, she moved quietly to the back door. If she could slip out unnoticed, she might be able to get away before they even realized she was gone. Slowly, she turned the lock, careful not to make a sound. She pushed the door open just enough to see the alley behind her house. It was empty. Taking a deep breath, she stepped outside and closed the door behind her. The cold night air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. She moved quickly, keeping low as she made her way toward the side street. If she could reach her car without them seeing, she could drive somewhere safe, anywhere but here. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Her heart leapt into her throat. They were coming. She forced herself to keep moving, ignoring the panic threatening to take over. She reached the corner of the house and peered around. The sedan was still parked out front, but one of the men was out of the car now, scanning the street. His posture was tense, alert. He was looking for her. She had to think fast. She couldn't go back inside. She couldn't risk leading them straight to the letters. Her only option was to keep going. Moving as quietly as possible, she slipped down the side alley, staying in the shadows. The city was only a few blocks away. If she could just make it to a public place, maybe they would back off. The sound of another car approaching made her freeze. Her blood ran cold as she saw headlights sweep across the alley. A second vehicle. This wasn't just some random coincidence. They were hunting her. She turned and ran. Her pulse roared in her ears as she sprinted down the alley, her boots slapping against the pavement. She didn't care about noise anymore. She just had to get away. Behind her, she heard shouting. Footsteps pounding after her. They were closing in. Ahead, the street opened up to a small shopping center. A few late-night stores still had their lights on. She spotted a gas station at the corner. If she could just get inside, she could call for help. A hand grazed her arm. She screamed, jerking away, stumbling forward as she broke free. The man cursed behind her, but she didn't stop. She lunged toward the gas station door, her fingers fumbling for the handle. She yanked it open and stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The cashier looked up in surprise, his eyes widening at the sight of her. She turned, expecting to see the men following her, but they had stopped. They stood just outside, watching her. One of them pulled out a phone and made a call. Then, slowly, they backed away. Celeste shivered as she watched them disappear into the night. They weren't giving up. They were just getting started. Celeste sat inside the gas station, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gulps. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, her mind still reeling from the chase. The cashier, a young man barely in his 20s, eyed her warily, unsure whether to ask if she was okay or to call someone. She knew she must have looked shaken, her hair disheveled, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes darting to the glass doors every few seconds. But the men were gone, at least for now. She forced herself to stand upright, pressing a hand to her forehead, willing herself to calm down. She needed to think, needed a plan. The letters in her bag felt heavier than ever, their presence a reminder that she had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to. The weight of her husband's secrets pressed against her, and the warning in his letter repeated in her head. Do not go any further. Do not ask questions. But it was too late for that. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She flinched at the sudden vibration before pulling it out. A number she didn't recognize flashed across the screen. Her finger hovered over the answer button, but something in her gut told her not to pick up. The call ended after a few rings. A moment later, another came in. Same number. She swallowed hard, ignored it again. They were trying to reach her. They knew she had the letters. They knew she had the box. The cashier cleared his throat. She turned toward him, realizing for the first time that she must have been standing there in complete silence for several minutes. "You okay?" he asked, hesitant. She managed a nod, then forced herself to walk toward the exit. She peeked outside, scanning the dark streets, but the black sedan was gone. That didn't mean they had left for good. She knew they were watching, waiting. She had to get out of here. Moving quickly, she slipped out of the gas station and made her way to the side street. Her car was parked several blocks away, and she had no choice but to walk. Each step felt like she was being watched, every shadow making her flinch. The city around her was quiet, only the occasional passing car breaking the silence. When she finally reached her car, she fumbled with the keys, her hands still shaking. She climbed inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. She needed to go somewhere safe, but where? If they had followed her home once, they could do it again. She couldn't risk leading them back. She considered the police. Reporting a break-in was one thing, but explaining why she was being followed, why she had a box full of secrets buried at her husband's grave, that was another. They would ask questions she wasn't sure she had answers to. A new idea struck her. James had mentioned a key in his letter. She hadn't found one in the box, which meant it had to be somewhere else. Maybe in their house? If she could find it, it might give her the next piece of the puzzle. She took a deep breath, started the engine, and drove home, keeping an eye on her mirrors the entire way. No sign of the sedan. No sign of the men. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were never far behind. When she pulled into her driveway, the house looked just as she had left it. The porch light cast a dim glow, and the windows were dark. Everything seemed normal, but normal no longer meant safe. She stepped out of the car, scanning the street before making her way to the front door. Her hands were steady now as she unlocked it and slipped inside, locking it again behind her. The silence of the house pressed in around her, familiar yet unsettling. She took slow steps toward the kitchen, placing the box back on the table where she had left it. Then a sound, a soft creak from the hallway. She froze. Someone was inside. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She hadn't left any windows open, hadn't unlocked any doors other than the front. And yet, she wasn't alone. She backed away slowly, reaching into her bag, fingers closing around the edges of the letters. She had no weapon. The gun was still in the box, and she wasn't sure she could bring herself to use it anyway. Another sound. Closer this time. Her breath hitched. Then the lights flickered, just for a moment, but enough to make her heart seize. A shadow moved past the doorway leading into the hallway. A jolt of fear shot through her. She turned and ran. Her feet pounded against the wooden floor as she sprinted toward the back door, fumbling with the lock. Just as she yanked it open, a heavy force slammed into her from behind, sending her crashing forward. Her knees hit the wooden deck, pain jolting up her legs. A hand closed around her wrist. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the grip was too strong. She twisted, catching a glimpse of a figure, dark clothing, masked face, one of the men from the cemetery. A voice, low and calm, cut through her panic. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fought against his hold. Another figure loomed behind him, standing in the doorway. "We don't want to hurt you," the first man continued. "Just give us what we came for." Celeste's mind raced. If she gave them the box, the letters, would they leave? Could she believe that? She thought of James, of his warning, "Do not trust anyone." She made her decision. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she lunged forward, driving her knee upward, connecting with the man's stomach. He grunted, momentarily loosening his grip. She ripped her arm free, scrambled to her feet, and ran. She didn't stop to think. She just ran. The fence at the back of her yard wasn't tall, but it felt impossibly high as she threw herself at it, clawing her way over. Behind her, the men shouted, but she didn't look back. She dropped down on the other side, hitting the pavement hard. Pain shot up her ankle, but she pushed through it, sprinting toward the nearest street. A car was coming. Headlights cut through the darkness, blinding her for a moment. She stumbled into the road, waving her arms wildly. The car screeched to a halt, the driver shouting something, but she didn't hear. She yanked the door open and jumped inside. "Drive," she gasped. "Please, just drive." The driver hesitated only a second before stepping on the gas, the car lurching forward. As they sped away, Celeste turned her head, just in time to see the two men standing at the edge of the street, watching her disappear into the night. They weren't done with her. Not yet. Celeste sat in the passenger seat of the stranger's car, her breath ragged, her hands shaking. The driver, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a tense jawline, kept glancing at her but said nothing at first. The car sped through the quiet streets, leaving behind the dark figures who had invaded her home, but she knew it wasn't over. They would find her again. They had followed her this far, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The woman driving finally spoke, her voice steady but questioning. "Are you in trouble?" Celeste hesitated. The truth was too much to explain in a few words. She could barely make sense of it herself. Instead of answering, she looked down at her bag, feeling the weight of the letters inside. James's warning echoed in her mind. Do not go any further. Do not ask questions. But she had already gone too far. She'd already seen too much. She forced herself to focus. She needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere she could think. The police? No, they wouldn't understand. She didn't have enough proof, only a rusted metal box, a gun she was too afraid to touch, and a stack of letters filled with vague warnings. What would she even tell them? That her dead husband had left behind a mystery and now men were hunting her for it? They'd dismiss her, tell her she was paranoid. She turned to the driver, her voice still unsteady. "Just take me somewhere with people, somewhere public." The woman nodded and drove toward the city center. The streets were quiet, but a few bars and diners were still open. Celeste spotted a 24-hour diner, its neon sign buzzing in the cold night air. She told the driver to stop. As soon as the car pulled up to the curb, Celeste opened the door and stumbled out, murmuring a quick, breathless thank you before hurrying inside. The diner was nearly empty, except for an old man nursing a coffee and a tired-looking waitress wiping down the counter. Celeste slid into a booth near the back, keeping her head down. She needed a plan. She needed answers. She reached into her bag and pulled out the letters, flipping through them, searching for something she had missed. Then she saw it. One of the letters, shorter than the others, was folded differently. She hadn't noticed before in her panic, but now, as she carefully unfolded it, something small slipped out. A key. It clattered onto the table, barely making a sound, but to Celeste it was deafening. She picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. It was old, heavy, not a house key. Her pulse quickened. James had written about a key, but she hadn't found one in the metal box at the cemetery. He must have hidden it separately. But what did it open? She looked back at the letter, scanning the words. "If you found this, then I ran out of time. They'll come looking for what I left behind. I couldn't destroy it, but I hid it. The key will take you there. Don't trust anyone, not even those who say they want to help." Celeste's throat tightened. Whatever James had been involved in, it had cost him his life, and now it was endangering hers. She flipped the key over again, searching for any markings. Then she noticed something. Engraved on the side, barely visible under the dim diner lights, was a set of numbers. An address. She grabbed her phone and quickly entered it into the Maps app. Her stomach clenched as the location popped up. It was a building on the other side of town. She didn't recognize it, but that didn't matter. It was where James had left his final secret. She tucked the key into her pocket and looked up. The waitress was staring at her now, curious but not concerned. The old man in the corner stirred his coffee absently, lost in thought. No one seemed to be paying her any real attention. That should have reassured her, but it didn't. She had to go. She left some cash on the table and hurried outside. The night air was sharp, biting through her thin jacket. She pulled it tighter around herself as she hailed a cab, giving the driver the address. The man grunted and started driving, and Celeste sat in tense silence, her fingers curled around the key in her pocket. The city blurred past, neon lights flashing in the darkness, but she barely saw them. Her thoughts were spinning. What had James hidden? Why had he left her these cryptic messages instead of just telling her the truth? Was he trying to protect her, or had he known she wouldn't believe him? The cab finally pulled up to a rundown building, the kind of place that had long been abandoned except for the occasional drifter. It looked like an old storage facility, the windows covered in dust, the walls cracked from neglect. Celeste hesitated before stepping out. The driver didn't wait. As soon as she shut the door, he sped off, leaving her alone in the dark, empty street. She took a deep breath and approached the building. The entrance was locked, but there was a side door with a rusted keyhole. She pulled the key from her pocket and slid it in. It fit. Her heart pounded as she turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with metal lockers. The air inside was stale, thick with dust. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing. At the far end of the hallway, she spotted a locker with a number that matched the last digits on the key. Her pulse quickened as she approached it. She inserted the key, turned it, and pulled the door open. Inside was a stack of documents, thick files bound together. There were photographs, too, grainy black and white images of men in suits, exchanging briefcases, standing in dimly lit alleyways. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Names, dates, transactions, bank accounts. James had been tracking something big. Then she saw it. A picture of him. James, standing beside the same man from the medallion. They weren't smiling. They weren't posing. The photo looked like it had been taken from a distance, without their knowledge. James had been followed. Watched. A noise behind her made her freeze. A shadow moved in the doorway. She turned just as the first man stepped into view, his face partially hidden by the dim light. "We told you not to go looking." Celeste's breath caught in her throat. A second man appeared beside him, blocking the exit. "You should have listened." Her mind raced. She was trapped. They had followed her here, waited for her to lead them straight to whatever James had hidden. But she wasn't going to give up now. She grabbed the stack of documents, shoving them into her bag. The men moved closer, their expressions cold, deliberate. Then, without thinking, Celeste turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't care. She just knew one thing. She couldn't let them catch her. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and share this one with your friends. See you next time.